talk about this technique that was used by Monet and is used by the three extremely significant Australian artists who we have today. This technique of painting in the fresh air, essentially. And I'd like to start with Michelle, if I could, simply because you've not only done this yourself, but you've taught about it. Can you give us a sense of what it was like when Monet and the others first went out into the field? How radical was that?
Well, actually, Richard, it really wasn't that radical. People had been painting en plein air for quite a while by then. A lot of the neoclassical painters of the late 18th century had been going out religiously in order to find material to sustain them in the painting of their classical landscapes. And they mostly did that in Rome. There was a prize where you would have the opportunity, if you won the prize for landscape painting, for example, as a Parisian student at the academy, you were then had the opportunity to paint in Rome for, say, 3 years. That'd be a lovely thing to, a prize to win these days, to be swanning about in Rome for 3 years painting and nothing else. So, you know, that it was actually quite well established that people would go and paint out of doors, and of course before that, people used to draw out of doors very frequently in order to, you know, study nature and find source of inspiration for their work. But so it wasn't actually a radical thing in itself to be out of doors. What was radical was to turn the paintings that you made out of doors into works which were thought to be the finished product. That was the radical thing.
Okay, because previously it was almost note-taking and then...
Well, it was, yes. They were very fine. They were very detailed and quite exquisite to look at them now. But they weren't ever presented as finished paintings. So what was radical was the fact that Monet was painting them substantially out of doors. There were large-scale pictures as well. People used to paint tiny pictures. I actually paint tiny pictures, so I sympathise. But he was painting quite large pictures out of doors, which I'm very impressed by, because it's no mean feat to be out there with an enormous canvas with wind and rain and various other things.
Yeah, no mean feat. Imants Tillers, is that right? What are the practical difficulties of taking the studio into the paddock?
When I moved from Sydney to Cooma, I spent a year going to the local group who went plein air painting, but I used to just take small panels. I think, you know, doing finished paintings outdoors is, you know, probably very difficult.
Mm. If Michelle's right, and the crucial thing is that it's a finished work that's created outdoors, can we understand what was the philosophical shift that made those French painters at that time do that?
Well, I think the Impressionists, Monet and the others, were really concerned about light, and it was almost a kind of scientific enterprise to actually try and paint light outside. And the way you did it was by observing the effects of light. You know, it wasn't something you could imagine in the studio.
And yet they often used big white brollies, didn't they, to sort of diffuse the light onto the canvas?
Yes, you can't have the light on the canvas itself.
Yeah.
It just washes everything out.
The canvas, that's more to protect the
We
canvas.
can talk about the logistics.
Yeah, logistics, Euan.
Yeah, probably, and probably don't ask me any tricky historical questions, because I might not be too good on those ones. But certainly the logistics of it it's actually quite a difficult thing. The general public make it quite difficult too. That's one of the aspects of it, that people come and ask you all sorts of curly questions and always infer that you're an absolute crap painter, which when you're out painting from the landscape you often feel,
yeah.
so, you know.
What they say is that meant to be that tree, mate? You're hopeless.
No, they always say they've got an aunt that paints and that she's really good,
yeah.
You know. Yeah. That's the implication.
And then you say who, and they say Grace Cossington-Smith, and you feel like a fool.
Fred Williams got a really hard time, so, you know, he actually gave up in disgust after someone criticised him. But the logistical paintings of painting outside are quite difficult, but... as these guys said, there's certain qualities you get outside that you can't get in the studio. For some people, painting in the studio is actually is liberating, because you don't have all that stuff in front of you. But for some people, it's actually very difficult. What do I paint?
Okay, so define those qualities you get outside that make it worth all the hassle.
Well, it's that relationship to reality, I guess. You're giving a sense of time and place, which we're all. When I was being taught, were actually very old-fashioned concerns, and it was totally poo-pooed. The whole idea of us painting a certain place at a certain time, so that someone could say, that's so and so, and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That was just seen as the most, anybody that did that, you just, forget about it. Fact, let alone paint. Painting was second, the second worst thing you could do.
I was just going to say, Euan, when I was a student, when I was at art school, I think landscape painting had reached its lowest ebb. Yes. It was probably the least fashionable thing you could do. Yeah, then again, Mr. Tillers was the most fashionable painter at that time, and he's done it, so it can't be too bad.
Talk to us about this, Imants, because in your work you both respond to that landscape, and yet you bring to it people say you're the high prince of postmodernism in this country. You bring all this culture and learning and knowledge and reference points to it. So you're simultaneously, it seems to me, responding to that place, but also to so many things from outside the place. So tell us about that double act.
That's more in the last 10 years or so. And at the beginning of my career, really, I wanted to oppose the landscape tradition, as did most of my contemporaries, because it seemed to have too much of a hold on, on Australian art, if you like. And I was interested in a lot of things apart from that, but I think probably it's the Aboriginal art movement that's changed that in a sense, because before that happened, really, there was Fred Williams, who I think is a great landscape artist or a great artist, and after that, I think Aboriginal art really took over the landscape tradition and turned it into something different. So then I actually became more interested in it, and really, I suppose my interest in landscape has partly been formed by that, and it was partly formed also by moving out of Sydney, to Cooma, which is a sort of remote town in the Snowy Mountains, and I just became more aware of the landscape around me, and I think also because it was unfamiliar, I took a greater interest in it.
Some critics have talked about this newfound spirit of place in your work. Yeah. When you're actually in that landscape and you're sitting there with a canvas, do you feel that what is your relationship with the landscape that you're painting? Okay,
well, it's quite contradictory, because the Monero is a very kind of austere, treeless sort of landscape, bit like some of the landscapes that McCann has depicted, and yet the place where where we actually live, we're sort of surrounded by this European garden. So there's this amazing contrast between the European and the Australian. So I guess I'm sort of shuffling between those two things all the time, and also, while I want to paint the landscape, it's more a kind of evocation of landscape. It's not actually a specific landscape. And so I'm sort of keeping to my principles of quotation and appropriation, but using both images and more I'm using language. So while they sort of relate to where I am and that sort of conflict, they're not literally of anywhere.
You're responding to a landscape, a real landscape in front of you, but at the same time you're bringing all these things to it. In your case, these allegorical figures often sit in these presumably real landscapes. How does that happen? Do you paint the landscape and then add the figures somewhere else, or do you do it all in that space?
I think most people, there are a few artists that do paint on plein air and that's it, like Tom Carment's a good example of that, fantastic paintings. He hasn't really got a studio, but for the majority of people, the on plein air is a studying for something else that happens in the studio, and certain places will be helpful for that. Going out into this, I just found going out into the in the landscape, I just loved it, and I think what Michelle said is right. It's just actually a beautiful experience. It's a way of experiencing the landscape. I'm not a very good person at sitting and doing nothing. If I go on holiday, I always take paper and pencils and go and draw. And I'm also very, very conscious whenever I go somewhere of the burden of history, the burden of trying to make sense of a place. I went to Alice Springs. I've been there a few times now and I absolutely love it, but I'm incredibly aware of how limited the Western way of painting is for an area like that and how incredibly impressive Aboriginal painting is. It's absolute perfect way of depicting that landscape. And you kind of think you're sitting there with this kind of perspective, one point, and it just seems so silly. But after a while you kind of forget that and you just sort of enjoy the fact of being there. For a long, long time I never ever showed any of the work I did on plein air and didn't even admit doing it. It was a kind of like an embarrassing thing. I just thought, no one is allowed to know that I even do this.
But Imants, can you talk to us about your relationship between the painter, his memory, his knowledge, and the physical gum tree, if you like, that's sitting in front of you?
Yeah, well, I guess, that's really hard, isn't it?
We've got 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what I try and do is try to be imbued by what's around me, and I am kind of obsessively focused on the things around me, which are fairly limited, and I guess.
So, how do you mean that? You mean in the landscape of Cooma?
Oh well, if you go to Sydney, for example, it involves an hour and a half on the bus to Canberra. So, and I do that quite frequently. Mm-hmm. So that you're kind of going through the same landscape over and over again, and it's quite, I don't know, you become quite familiar with it.
Does that restrictive palette of images help or hinder?
Well, I usually just make notes for paintings, right, which aren't necessarily directly about what's going past, but I think. Over the years, I've probably absorbed the kind of colouring and the light and things like that, which I don't actually think about, and that's what kind of comes through in the paintings.
So there'd often be no specific location.
No.
For these images.
No, not at all. It's just the sense of living in that landscape.
Okay, but that's different for you, isn't it, Michelle? Obviously, you're not a photographer out there, but there is an image there, isn't there? There's a real tree, if you like.
There is a real tree, but it's amazing how infrequently the things you have in front of you can be painted directly. I mean, often what you're trying to paint is something that you see in your mind, but it's not really visible. It's the invisible qualities of a particular place. Sometimes there's a sort of a feeling of an inherent geometry in a particular combination of elements that you're trying to draw out in a painting, but it's not really there if you photographed it.
Yes.
So,
and similarly, when you've created an image like this, does it surprise you when you go back to that park and you see how it really is, because you've so much created in your mind?
Yes, it does. It does surprise me. I was going to just comment on something about pleasure, to do with what Euan was saying. In some ways, being a landscape painter is an excuse to be a plein air painter, because it really is. I mean, apart from the difficulties, it's a bit like childbirth. You don't remember the difficulties. You only remember the pleasure. And, I mean, think of going off to Nielsen Park, for example, which is a kind of paradise in the middle of the city, doing a good drawing, because, of course, you feel much better if it's been a good drawing, of some, coastal Banksia or something, and finding the rhythms within it and, just feeling like that was a good day's or afternoon's work, and then strip off, go for a swim, and you don't really feel like you're working, actually.
No.
Shouldn't be telling people this.
I know, that's right.
I don't mean strip off completely, but...
Well, so we won't accept any directions from you guys, because you'll say turn right at the big white rock and it won't be white at all and it won't be big. It'll all be created in here. Is that right?
Well, I think ultimately you are trying to create something memorable, something beautiful, something suggestive, symbolic. These are not things that are photographable. These are things that the imagination has to conjure up. And one other point is that, if we think about music, we're used to the idea that people perform music really, really beautifully, but they don't have to compose the music. Whereas if you think of a painter, a painter and this is what's brilliant, this is the amazing thing about Monet, is that a painter is not just performing. It is a kind of performance. You're out in the field. You've got to perform. You can't sort of say, I'll do it later. You know, you've really got to be there and give it everything you've got. But at the same time, you're composing. You have to be, you're the author. Yeah. You're not just painting somebody else's.
No, you're saying the Sydney Symphony Orchestra is just another tribute band. I agree. A lot of writers talk to me about their daily frustration that their technique isn't equal to what they want to express. Do you guys feel that as well? Even such accomplished artists?
Sure, of course.
Yeah. Every day?
Of course, yeah. Of course, yeah. No, I mean, that's... and you have to drop that. I mean, that's how you start off, and then you have to drop it. You start off with thinking, you know, you might think you're pretty special, and as soon as you get out there, you realise you're not pretty fast. And you might start off by thinking, I want to produce a really meaningful work. Yeah. And, I mean, you drop that pretty fast. Yeah. But I was just wanting to say that I thought some of the most successful landscape painters, and Imants mentioned Colin McCann, and I mean, it's almost what he doesn't put in is just as important as what he does put in. And he had that ability to distill New Zealand. There's such a sense of New Zealand, and yet you think, how did he do that with so few marks? I mean, you know, and Fred Williams did the kind of same thing here. I mean, Nolan to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when you're out there, there is a real sense of struggling to sort of say something a bit unique, but often just comes down to just a struggle to say anything, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And hopefully when you get back, as Michelle says, hopefully you've done something that's vaguely kind of okay. But it's a struggle, you know. It's
Imants, do you feel the paint won't do what you want it to do?
Well, I think the important thing for me has been to kind of discover a process in which you can be an artist, in which you can produce art. So it's actually more important to have something that allows you to keep going. And, you know, the results are sometimes they might be good or bad, but...
but what's that process that you've discovered that has enabled that?
Well, it's very kind of personal, but, you know... well, it's a process whereby I don't have to kind of invent the wheel every time I do a new painting. I just basically, add something or change something slightly from what I've been working on.
He won't tell us, so I imagine it involves whiskey.
I'm not allowed to have that.
Let's take a moment to finish, to talk about Monet, who's the reason we've all come here tonight, and I hope people are going to take the opportunity to go down and see the exhibition. He's inspired so many artists, and so many artists put him on their sort of list of the people who have really affected their work. How come, Imants? Why is he that for so many people?
Oh, well, I don't know for other people so much, but Monet wasn't always popular. Evidently, after he died, he went through a kind of significant period where no one liked his work, and it was really only the... you know, with Pollock and the abstract expressionists that they rediscovered, you know, the importance of Monet. But for me, it's always been, I don't know, I just have a real response, you know, standing in front of his work. And I, you know, have seen quite a few of his works. And I think it's something that I can't really articulate, but obviously there's something in the painting that really affects me quite deeply.
For those of us who are about to head down, with your painterly eye, what's one thing we should look for when we stare into those canvases?
Well, I think it's kind of sheer beauty, and it's something kind of beyond the subject matter. You know, it's really... I mean, Monet's work does kind of emanate light. You know, he was trying to capture light, but I think his works actually emanate light.
The light, that's what we're going to look at from Imants. What about from you, Michelle? Why has he influenced so many artists, and what should we, as individuals, look for when we go downstairs?
I agree with Imants. I think it's his ability to transform what might otherwise be quite a banal scene. I mean, these are all photographable scenes. In the past, paintings of landscapes were constructed. They were constructed from multiple views. They were constructed from the history. You know, the sort of the tradition of landscape would always inform artists as they constructed their landscapes. It wasn't as if they'd just go out and paint a view. It's actually quite hard to make a singular view interesting. You know, for a start, you've got these very, you know, flat foregrounds, which are highly uninteresting. If you've ever tried to paint, a flat field, it's very hard to make it interesting. But of course, the language of his paintings, the way his methods, his materials, the way he sees everything through his materials and his touch, the touch of his brush, and he transforms it both physically. He makes this incredibly tangible physical object, and at the same time there's this extraordinary feeling of something intangible.
Euan, why has he influenced so many people? What do we look for downstairs?
I think one of the things with Monet is you kind of think, oh, yeah, he's so popular and ho-hum, I'll look at them all. But then they do blow you away. Some of them are sensational. And I guess the ones I respond to are the subtle ones, the ones that, as Michelle says, they almost just dissolve, And he has got that ability to paint what you can't see. It's easy enough to paint a tree, but to paint the air around the tree or the sense of the tree going into the earth, or those are the things that are very, very difficult to get a sense of. And just his touch and the beauty of them, they really are quite amazing.
Well, let's hope people stop coming up to you and bothering you in the field, telling you can't paint for nothing.
Yeah, if you see me, please just walk the other way.
Especially now you've talked to us so beautifully about this process and what goes on. Thank you so much for revealing so much about your artwork. Can you please thank Euan, Imants and Michelle?